James Carter had built his convenience store from the ground up. Nestled in a small town, Carter's Corner was more than a store, it was a place where people gathered, shared stories, and found comfort in familiar faces. His success had drawn attention, and when he expanded, he hired a manager named Greg, who had retail experience but lacked respect for James. At first, Greg acted professional, but soon, he started making small, passive-aggressive comments. "You sure you own this place?" he would say with a smirk. James brushed it off, believing action spoke louder than words. One evening, James walked in wearing a simple hoodie and jeans. Greg, who was manning the register, narrowed his eyes. "We're closed," he said flatly. James glanced at the open sign. "Greg, it's my store. I just came to check on inventory." Greg sneered. "No, you're trespassing. Get out before I call the cops." James clenched his fists but kept calm. He had dealt with prejudice before. "I hired you, Greg. You work for me." "Not anymore," Greg said, stepping closer. "I changed the locks. You don't belong here." Stunned but composed, James walked out. He could have fought back immediately, but he had a better idea. The next morning, he arrived with the police and legal documents proving ownership. Greg, still smug, folded his arms. When the officers verified the paperwork, the smirk disappeared. "Mr. Carter," one officer said, handing him the keys. "Everything checks out. This is your property." James took them with a nod, then turned to Greg. "You're fired. Get out." Greg stammered, trying to argue, but it was over. Instead of celebrating, James did something unexpected. A week later, he reopened the store and personally stood behind the counter. When customers asked why he was working the register instead of hiring a new manager, he simply smiled. "Because this store isn't just about making money," he said. "It's about serving the community. And no one can take that from me." Word spread quickly about what had happened, and soon, Carter's Corner was busier than ever. People came not just to shop but to show support. James greeted every customer with a warm smile, proving that dignity and perseverance outweighed hatred. One afternoon, as James was stocking shelves, the bell above the door jingled. To his surprise, Greg walked in. He looked different, not as smug, not as sure of himself. He hesitated before approaching the counter. James remained calm. "Can I help you?" Greg shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I messed up," he admitted. "I let my ignorance get the best of me. I was wrong." James crossed his arms. "You humiliated me in my own store. Why are you really here?" Greg exhaled. "I lost my job. No one wants to hire me after what happened. I came to apologize, but," he hesitated before adding, "I also need work." James studied him for a long moment. He had every right to turn Greg away, to let him feel the full weight of his actions. But then he thought about what the store truly stood for. "I don't trust you," James said honestly. "But if you really want to change, you'll start from the bottom. No management, no special treatment. Just work." Greg swallowed hard. "I'll take it." And so, under James's watchful eye, Greg stocked shelves, swept floors, and learned what it truly meant to serve. Over time, something changed in him. He listened more, judged less, and started treating people with respect. Months passed, and one evening, as James counted the register, Greg walked up. "I finally get it," he said. "This store isn't just about business, it's about people." Years passed, and Carter's Corner thrived, becoming more than just a store, it was a pillar of the community. James had expanded, adding a small cafe section where people could sit, talk, and enjoy freshly brewed coffee. The atmosphere was warm, welcoming, and filled with life. Greg remained a steady presence. He never asked for a higher position, never assumed he deserved forgiveness overnight. He worked hard, proving through actions rather than words that he had changed. The customers noticed. The same people who once looked at him with skepticism now greeted him with nods of approval. James smiled, the weight of past wrongs finally lifting. That's the whole point. Carter's Corner remained a symbol of resilience, proving that sometimes, justice isn't just about consequences, it's about redemption. Years passed, and Carter's Corner thrived, becoming more than just a store, it was a pillar of the community. James had expanded, adding a small cafe section where people could sit, talk, and enjoy freshly brewed coffee. The atmosphere was warm, welcoming, and filled with life. Greg remained a steady presence. He never asked for a higher position, never assumed he deserved forgiveness overnight. He worked hard, proving through actions rather than words that he had changed. The customers noticed. The same people who once looked at him with skepticism now greeted him with nods of approval. One evening, as James was closing up, Greg approached him. "Can I ask you something?" James leaned against the counter. "Go ahead." Greg hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Why did you give me a second chance? After everything I did, you could have let me fail." James studied him for a moment before responding. "Because hate is easy. Forgiveness is harder, but it builds something real." He folded his arms. "And I wanted you to see the difference." Greg nodded slowly, understanding now what he hadn't before. He looked around the store, his workplace, his second chance, the place that had shaped him into a better man. A few years later, James made a big decision. At a community gathering, surrounded by customers, friends, and family, he stood in front of the store and announced his retirement. Gasps and murmurs filled the air until he raised a hand. "I built Carter's Corner with love and hard work, but it's time to pass it on." He smiled and turned to Greg, who stood frozen in shock. "Greg will be taking over." Greg's eyes widened. "James, You earned it," James interrupted. "Not because you asked, not because you expected it, but because you proved that people can change. And this store deserves someone who understands what it truly means to serve." Tears welled up in Greg's eyes as he accepted the keys. The same store where he had once tried to push James out was now being handed to him, not as an act of punishment, but of trust. Carter's Corner remained a place of community, resilience, and redemption. And as Greg stood at the counter, greeting customers with the same warmth James had always shown, he realized that true ownership wasn't about power, it was about responsibility. Years rolled by, and under Greg's leadership, Carter's Corner continued to flourish. He maintained James's tradition of community service, ensuring that the store remained more than just a business, it was a safe space for everyone. He started programs for struggling families, offered discounts to seniors, and even sponsored local school events. Despite the success, Greg never forgot where he had started. Every morning, he was the first to arrive, sweeping the front steps before unlocking the doors. He greeted every customer by name, just as James had once done. People noticed the change in him, not just in his actions but in his heart. One evening, as Greg was closing up, he heard the familiar jingle of the doorbell. He looked up and saw James standing there, a proud smile on his face. "Thought you'd be enjoying retirement," Greg joked, wiping his hands on a rag. James chuckled. "I am. But I had to come see how my old place was doing." He glanced around the store, nodding in approval. "You've done good, Greg. Better than I ever imagined." Greg swallowed, the weight of those words hitting deep. "It's because of you," he admitted. "You gave me a second chance when no one else would." James placed a hand on his shoulder. "No, Greg. You took that chance and turned it into something real." They stood there for a moment, two men who had started as enemies but ended as something closer to family. As James turned to leave, he paused at the door. Keep the light on, Greg. This store, this place, it changes people. Greg nodded. It changed me. James gave one final smile before walking into the night, knowing that Carter's Corner was in the right hands. And as Greg locked up for the evening, he looked around the store, feeling the weight of its history and the responsibility of its future. Carter's Corner was more than a store. It was proof that people could change, that redemption was real, and that, sometimes, the most unexpected second chances led to the greatest stories. Years passed, and Carter's Corner grew into something even bigger than Greg had imagined. The store was no longer just a local shop, it was a landmark of the town, a place where stories were shared, friendships were built, and lives were changed. Greg never stopped working hard. He expanded the cafe section, started a food drive for families in need, and even created a mentorship program for young people looking for jobs. He wanted Carter's Corner to be more than just a place of business, he wanted it to be a place of opportunity, just as James had made it for him. One day, as Greg was sorting through old files in the back office, he found something unexpected, a framed photograph of James from the early days of Carter's Corner. Underneath the picture, in James's handwriting, were the words, "A store is just a building. The people inside make it a home." Greg smiled, feeling the truth of those words more than ever. Later that evening, as he locked up for the night, he noticed a young man lingering outside. He looked nervous, hesitant, the way Greg once had when he first came back after losing everything. "Need something?" Greg asked, stepping outside. The young man hesitated before speaking. I heard you give people second chances," he said quietly. "I made some mistakes. No one else will hire me." Greg studied him for a moment, seeing a reflection of his own past in the boy's anxious eyes. He thought about James, about the forgiveness he had been given, about the way his life had changed because of one man's belief in redemption. Greg reached into his pocket and pulled out a store apron. "Come back tomorrow at 8, he said. "Let's see if you're willing to work for that second chance." The boy's eyes lit up with surprise and relief. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Greg simply nodded. "Just don't waste it." As the young man walked away, Greg looked back at the store, the neon sign casting a warm glow over the street. He could almost hear James's voice, full of wisdom and warmth. "Keep the light on, Greg. This place changes people." And as he stepped back inside, Greg knew that Carter's Corner wasn't just a store, it was a legacy. A legacy of kindness, redemption, and second chances. As the years rolled on, Carter's Corner continued to thrive, becoming more than just a business, it became a tradition. Parents who once came in as children now brought their own kids, sharing stories of how the store had always been a place of warmth and acceptance. Greg remained at the heart of it all, dedicating himself to serving the community. He hired people who needed a fresh start, former convicts, single parents struggling to make ends meet, teenagers looking for guidance. He gave them all the same opportunity James had once given him. One afternoon, as Greg was wiping down the counter, he noticed a familiar figure at the door. His heart swelled with warmth as James Carter, now older and moving a little slower, stepped inside. The customers recognized him immediately, and murmurs of admiration filled the room. James smiled, tipping his hat to those who greeted him before making his way to the counter. Greg grinned. "Back for your store, old man?" James chuckled. "Looks like you've done a fine job without me." He looked around, eyes twinkling with pride. "I always knew you'd take care of this place." Greg exhaled, emotions tightening in his chest. "I just tried to live up to what you built." James patted his shoulder. "No, son. You built something even greater." Greg swallowed hard at the word son. It wasn't something James had ever said before, but in that moment, it felt right. Over the years, they had become more than former employer and employee. They had become family. The two men sat down in the cafe section, drinking coffee and reminiscing about the old days. They laughed about Greg's early mistakes, about the time he stocked canned goods in the freezer by accident, and about the first time he ever got a customer's name wrong. As the sun began to set, James sighed, staring out the window. "I won't be around forever, Greg." Greg stiffened. "Don't start talking like that." James smiled. "It's just the truth. But it doesn't worry me. Because I know Carter's Corner is in good hands." Greg looked around the store, at the employees laughing behind the counter, at the customers chatting like old friends, at the young boy he had hired last week nervously stacking shelves. He realized then that Carter's Corner wasn't just James's legacy, it was now his, too. James finished his coffee and stood up. "Keep the light on, Greg." Greg nodded, his throat tight. "Always." James gave one last smile before walking out, his silhouette fading into the glow of the streetlights. Greg watched him go, feeling both the weight and the honor of carrying on his mentor's dream. And as he turned back to the store, hearing the familiar sounds of laughter and life inside, he knew one thing for certain: Carter's Corner would always be a place of second chances, of hope, and of home. Years passed, and Carter's Corner became more than just a store, it became a cornerstone of the town's identity. People would say, "If you ever need a fresh start, go to Carter's." It wasn't just about groceries or coffee anymore, it was about redemption, about giving people a place to belong. Greg, now older with streaks of gray in his hair, continued to run the store with the same dedication James had once shown. Every morning, he unlocked the doors before the sun rose, and every night, he was the last to leave, just as James had taught him. One autumn evening, as Greg stood outside, watching the last few customers leave, a young woman approached hesitantly. She looked tired, carrying a small child on her hip, her clothes worn and her eyes full of uncertainty. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly. I heard this place gives people second chances." Greg studied her for a moment, recognizing the quiet desperation in her voice. It was the same desperation he had once felt when he had walked back into this store, hoping for forgiveness. He smiled warmly. "We do," he said. "What's your name?" "Aisha," she replied. "I lost my job. I have experience working in stores, but no one will hire me." She adjusted her grip on the child, holding him close. "I just need a chance." Greg nodded, already knowing his answer. "Can you start tomorrow morning?" Aisha's eyes widened, disbelief washing over her face. "Just like that?" Greg chuckled. "James Carter once gave me a second chance when I didn't deserve one. Now, it's my turn to pass that forward." Tears welled in Aisha's eyes as she clutched her son. "Thank you," she whispered. Greg simply smiled and held the door open for her. "Welcome to Carter's Corner." As he watched her walk inside, he thought about James, about the way he had once stood at this very door, offering Greg a path forward. The cycle had come full circle, and now, it was his turn to carry on the tradition. That night, as he turned off the lights and locked up, Greg looked at the neon sign glowing softly in the darkness. He could almost hear James's voice again, the words echoing in his mind. "Keep the light on, Greg. This place changes people." And so, he did. The years seemed to blend together, with each day at Carter's Corner carrying the same warmth, the same sense of purpose that James had instilled in Greg all those years ago. The store had expanded, now offering a small community center in the back where locals could host meetings, hold events, or simply sit together to share a meal. It was a place where everyone felt seen, valued, and welcomed. Aisha had blossomed in her new role. She started as a cashier but quickly proved herself in every aspect of the business. She helped organize the food drives, assisted with the mentorship program, and even began training new hires, just as Greg had once trained her. Greg saw a reflection of his own journey in Aisha, a reminder that no one's past should define their future. One cool winter morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the store windows, Greg found himself at the counter, sipping his coffee, when a familiar face appeared in the doorway. It was James, older now, his steps slower, but still carrying that same quiet authority. Greg stood up, his heart racing with gratitude and emotion. "James," he said, voice thick with nostalgia. "I didn't expect you to visit today." James smiled, but there was a softness to his gaze. "I wanted to see how things were going. I hear you've been doing good work." He glanced around, taking in the bustling store and the sound of laughter in the air. Greg nodded, pride swelling in his chest. "It's all because of what you built, James. This place, it's your legacy." James shook his head. "No, Greg. You're the one who kept it alive. I always knew you had it in you." His voice cracked slightly, and for a moment, there was a pause in the conversation. Greg felt a lump in his throat. "You gave me the chance when no one else would. I'm just passing it on." James took a deep breath, looking around at the store once more, taking in the life within it. "You've done more than pass it on. You've made it something even more beautiful than I ever could have imagined." They both stood there in silence, the weight of the years between them heavy but comforting. "I'm proud of you, Greg," James said softly. "You made Carter's Corner everything I dreamed it could be, and more." Greg, overwhelmed with emotion, shook his head. "I couldn't have done it without you, James. You showed me what it meant to build something that wasn't just for business, but for people. For hope." James reached out and placed a hand on Greg's shoulder, just as he had done years ago. "You've done more than that. You've built a home. And that's something that lasts forever." Later that day, as Greg closed the store and prepared to head home, he stood outside, staring up at the glowing sign of Carter's Corner. He could feel James's presence beside him, still guiding him, even if from afar. He knew that Carter's Corner would always be a place where people could find new beginnings, where forgiveness was given, and where lives could be rebuilt. And just as it had for him, it would continue to change lives, one second chance at a time. And so, as he locked the door and turned off the lights, he whispered softly into the night, "I'll keep the light on, James. Always." With that, he walked away, knowing that Carter's Corner would never stop shining. Years passed, and Carter's Corner continued to stand as a symbol of second chances, hope, and community. Greg had grown into a well-respected figure in town, a leader who had learned to combine business with compassion, creating an environment where people could find not just products, but opportunity, support, and kindness. Aisha, now a manager, had taken on much more responsibility, helping to steer the store through its expansion while keeping the core values intact. The mentorship program flourished, and many of the young people who had once walked through the doors with no direction had gone on to pursue careers, start families, and, in some cases, return to Carter's Corner as employees or customers. One fall afternoon, as the golden light of dusk filtered through the windows, Greg sat in his usual spot behind the counter, a cup of coffee in hand, watching the world outside. The store was alive with activity, families chatting, people exchanging recipes, the sound of children's laughter filling the air. He had seen it all, the hard times, the struggles, the transformations. But there was one constant: Carter's Corner had always been a place where people found themselves, found each other. And it was all thanks to the foundation James had laid so many years ago. As Greg sat there, deep in thought, he heard the familiar jingle of the doorbell. He looked up and saw a figure step inside, a figure that caused his heart to race. It was an older woman, her face weathered by time but kind and familiar. She carried a bag of groceries, and there was something about her presence that felt like home. She walked up to the counter, her eyes meeting Greg's with a quiet recognition. "You don't remember me, do you?" she asked gently. Greg furrowed his brow, studying her for a moment. The recognition clicked. He hadn't seen her in years, but he could never forget that face. "I do," he said, his voice soft. "You were one of the first people I ever hired when I took over this store." The woman smiled, her eyes brimming with emotion. "You gave me a job when no one else would. You were the one who saw something in me when I had nothing to offer." She paused, her voice thick with gratitude. "I've never forgotten that." Greg felt a lump in his throat, a deep sense of appreciation filling him. "You helped me more than I could ever help you," he said, the words raw with sincerity. "You gave me the chance to believe in something bigger than myself." The woman's smile widened. "And you turned that chance into a place where people like me can find hope. Carter's Corner, it's become more than just a store. It's a lifeline." Greg nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "It's always been about the people. About giving them a second chance, just like I got." The woman took a deep breath, setting her bag of groceries on the counter. "I've got something for you," she said, reaching into her purse. She pulled out a small, weathered notebook and slid it across to him. Greg looked at it, puzzled. "What is it?" The woman smiled warmly. "It's a journal. I started it when I first began working here. Every day, I wrote down a little note about my experience, about what I was learning. I thought you might like to have it. It's a small way of giving back, of telling you how much Carter's Corner has meant to me." Greg's eyes widened as he gently opened the notebook. Inside were pages filled with handwritten words, notes of gratitude, and reflections on the impact Carter's Corner had made in her life and in the lives of others. "I can't take this," Greg said softly, feeling overwhelmed. "You already did," she replied. "You took it years ago when you gave me that first chance. This is just a reminder of the good you've done. Of the difference you've made." Greg carefully closed the notebook, tears threatening to spill as he looked at the woman before him. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for reminding me of why I do this. Of why we all do this." The woman nodded, her eyes shining. "You'll never know how many lives you've touched, Greg. But trust me, there are many. And Carter's Corner is a place where that will always continue." As the woman left the store, Greg stood there for a long time, holding the journal close to his chest. He thought about the years that had passed, the people who had walked through those doors, and the countless lives that had been changed, just as his had been so long ago. He knew, deep in his heart, that Carter's Corner would never truly belong to him. It belonged to everyone who had ever walked in, to everyone who had been given a second chance, to everyone who had found hope in its walls. And as long as he kept the light on, the legacy of James and all those who had come before would continue to burn brightly. As the store quieted for the night, Greg whispered to himself, "I'll keep the light on. Always." And with that, he locked the doors and stepped out into the world, knowing that Carter's Corner would continue to change lives, for as long as there was hope, and as long as people believed in second chances.